Wow, that's some gospel text for Father's Day. So happy Father's Day to all fathers. On this day we have been called to be at odds with others, and mothers to be at odds with their daughter-in-laws and son-in-laws. But Jesus has a point. The point of today's gospel text is really about discipleship. I'm quite clear that Jesus does not literally mean that his message and his presence and his ministry and the gospel is supposed to divide families and friends and households. But he is making a very clear point that to be a disciple of Jesus means that Jesus and the work of the gospel and the work of God's kingdom in the world must take precedent. That it has to be at the center of who we are. That being a disciple of Jesus must define our character, the way in which we live, the way in which we behave, the way in which we treat one another. And Jesus, although he goes to the very deep end of the pool to make the point that there can never be any conflict between one's allegiance to the world and one's allegiance to God. Which is why Jesus says elsewhere in the scriptures, you cannot serve God and the world. We often hear that text translated as God and mammon, and we have translated mammon in many ways to mean money or material, property and goods, or anything that is able to divide us from our relationship with God. Anything that impedes us developing a wholesome, healthy relationship with God is considered mammon. And so for some of us, it's not money. Some of us manage money well, and so we have a healthy perspective around money, and so it's not money. Some of us have a healthy perspective about our jobs. We don't have to be the CEO or the COO, but we're happy exactly where we are in mid-management, lower management, or wherever we are in the system, and so that's not mammon. It doesn't corrupt who we are. It doesn't shatter our worldview of who we are. And we are okay with the life God has given us. And there are some of us who, for others, it's not trying to keep up with the Joneses. We don't need the fanciest car or the biggest house or the greatest neighborhood in order to have security and identity in God. And so, Jesus in today's text, it's really about discipleship. It's a continuation of Jesus' teachings over the past 2 weeks, readying this new group of disciples who have no earthly idea what's in store for them as they follow Jesus. I think they perhaps believe that following Jesus is like following any other rabbi or any other rabbinical teachings, that Jesus is going to shed some light on what it means to be a follower of God and the work that disciples must do in the world to be change agents of the world. I suspect that the disciples of Jesus are clueless about what it means to give one's life fully and totally over to God. I believe that church folk don't really understand the gravity of the call of being a disciple. Because we tend to be disciples insofar as it doesn't push in on our safety or security zone. We don't mind being disciples when it makes us feel good and we feel safe. But it's difficult being a disciple when the Spirit of God is calling us to go to places that make us very uncomfortable and to deal with people, quite frankly, who make us uncomfortable. And yet, that's what Jesus is preparing his disciples to do. The men and women who are with him, Jesus is saying, this is serious business. And in order for you to make the most out of being a disciple, it's going to cost us something. It's going to cost you something. It's going to make you feel uncomfortable. It's going to provoke you to rethink what it means to be in a relationship with God. Being a disciple is more than just coming to church on Sunday and listening to beautiful music and hearing a sermon and eating some wonderful barbecue. Being a disciple means, God, I'm willing to follow whatever you lead. And I'm willing to take up my cross and follow you, even if that means my life. This is why in John's gospel, when Jesus begins to really talk about what it means to be a disciple, the text tells us that at the beginning of Jesus' teaching in John's gospel, around the 5th or 6th chapter of the gospel, Jesus has a sizable following behind him. There are people who were willing to follow and to listen and to be taught by Jesus. But the more they listened to Jesus, the more Jesus was beginning to make what they understood to be unreasonable demands on his life, on their life. They began to think, wait a minute, what he said earlier made sense. But now he's asking me to do things and to give up things that I'm not prepared to do. And then, of course, what really does it is when Jesus says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you shall have no part in me. And that was it. Because people took literally that Jesus was talking about the eating of flesh and the drinking of blood when he was saying, unless you are in fellowship or communion or community with me, you can't really understand what I'm about. And the text says Jesus turns, looks behind him, and half the crowd left him. And so he says to his disciples, do you want to leave me also? And they stay with Jesus, but I am certain they were thinking just like those who dropped off the parade line. I'm sure Jesus' disciples were scratching their heads trying to figure out what does he mean when he says that we must now eat flesh and drink blood in order to be a disciple. I mean, being a disciple of Jesus is hard work and it's serious work, but it's rewarding. There's a tension in following blindly the call of the Spirit and somehow trusting that by following Jesus blindly, we're going to fulfill the work, the mandate that God has given us. And so when Jesus prepares his disciples to be apostles, so what he's doing is he's preparing them to be apostles, which is why Jesus says, a student is not above the teacher, but at some point what Jesus ultimately says is, but at some point I'm going to expect you to be teachers, and I'm going to expect you to raise up students for the work of the gospel. And so those of us who are sitting in Grace Church, whether you believe yourself to be a student or a teacher of the gospel, at some point we all must be teachers of the gospel. At some point, when the Spirit like Pentecost blows upon you and the light bulb goes off, you begin to say, there's more work I feel God is calling me to do in the church. I've been a student of the gospel for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. It doesn't matter how long. But at some point, God is going to tap you on the shoulder and say, come higher. You know more than you know. Trust that God is going to lead you. And so I am looking out at a wonderful sea of disciples. You're all no doubt disciples, and we got some apostles scattered among us. Those of us who are willing to follow Christ, to take up our cross, and to be the very best Christians we might be. And so don't allow the gospel text with its harsh words from Jesus of all of this division. He is not asking any of us to decide family or me. He's not asking us to do that. But he is suggesting, highly suggesting, emphatically suggesting, that you cannot be a disciple if I'm not at the center of who you are. That when the world looks at you, they should first see me. Is your spiritual identity and character shaped around who you are and who I am and the image we would like to project to the world? Or does the world see you in all of my brokenness and our shortcomings and our failures? Will you allow the world to look beyond all of that and to see the God who dwells in you? That's the power of discipleship. That's what it means to trust in the power of God. Okay, so I have to tell you, Grace Church, this is interesting because I did not intend to preach on the gospel text. I actually wanted to preach on Genesis. But hearing the gospel text read moved me to say something about discipleship. I actually had notes on Genesis. I wrote nothing on the gospel. And so, speaking off the top of my head, I hope says to you how much I truly trust in the Spirit to give me words. I had no idea what to say on the gospel text, but I want to say something about Genesis because I wrote a few notes on Genesis. Seldom do I preach on the Old Testament. It is, by design, I always preach on the gospel, and if I could weave in something from the Old Testament, I'll do so. But normally, I'm generally comfortable with the gospel. That's who we are. We are Christ-centered people, and it's important to me that we hear what Jesus has to say. But I have to tell you, if you don't know the story in Genesis regarding the birth of Isaac and the inter-family, inter-ethnic turmoil that is happening in Abraham's household, I want to encourage you to go back and to read that story. It is one of the few Old Testament stories I am willing to put the gospel aside to preach. Because this text is more than just about intertribal conflict and interfamily conflict. This is in some ways, though the Genesis text, as you know, precedes and far predates the Gospels, the very things that Jesus speaks about in the Gospel text, about the divisions of family and mothers against fathers and sons against daughters and in-laws against one another, is happening in today's text in Genesis. So keep in mind, chronologically, that by the time we get to Genesis 21, it has been at least a quarter of a century when the angel appeared to Abraham and says to him, or they say to him, remember there are three individuals, but one is speaking, that your wife Sarai, who is barren, will bear a child. So it's important to keep this in mind, that it has been at least a quarter of a century since that exchange. Sometimes when we read the Bible, we assume that these events are happening one right after the other. The moment the angel says Sarai is going to bear a child, 9 months later, Sarah bears Isaac. Not so. Years pass, actually, from the time that God announces to Abraham that Sarai will bear a child. But mind you, because Sarai was barren, Sarai gave Abraham permission to sleep with Hagar, the Egyptian slave, to bear a child so that he could have lineage. I think Sarah, at that time, probably saw in her husband Abraham some pain of not being able to have an heir. And in antiquity, having an heir to pass on your name and your legacy, as it is important for some folk now, it was important then. And so she says to Abraham, you have my permission to sleep with Hagar and to bear a child. So, as a parenthetical note, I want to say very early on in Scripture, in Genesis, we see the power of women. It is Sarai who says to Abraham, you have my permission to do this. And I'm sure that for Sarai, it broke her heart because I'm sure she loved Abraham and she would love to give Abraham what he wants, which is an heir. In particular, at this time, a male heir to pass on his wealth and his property, but nevertheless, an heir. And he does. And that's where Ishmael comes in. So in the household, there is Sarai, Abraham's first wife, and there is Hagar, and though they are not officially married, because she bore his child, and because Ishmael is now entitled as the oldest child to receive a double portion of Abraham's wealth, we have a problem. In this household, you have Sarai, who could not give Abraham what he wanted, what he desired. You have Hagar, who is obedient. She's an obedient slave woman, an Egyptian slave woman. She's obedient, and she does what she's told. I don't assume, and we should not assume, that Hagar was looking forward to bearing Abraham's child. But this is the family structure of the day. And Scripture tells us that, by and large, they lived comfortably with one another, not without some skirmishes, because the text tells us that after the birth of Ishmael, Hagar is mistreated by Sarai to the point where she leaves. Hagar leaves. She runs away because she is so ill-treated by Sarah, perhaps out of jealousy. She sees Hagar playing with her son, Abraham's son, and she's sort of the third wheel in her own family. And so she's exhibiting human tendencies. She's jealous, she's angry, she's frustrated, and she's mistreating Hagar. Hagar leaves. But then something interesting happens on the first departure. It is out in the wilderness when God appears to Hagar and says, I want you to return. And just before I say this, I have to tell you, Grace Church, this is part of that text. And I love this story. But this is the part of that text that makes me a bit uncomfortable. Hagar is running away from an abusive situation. And God says to her, I want you to return. And I want you to be obedient to Sarah. And so one has to ask, why would God order Hagar to return back to what she believes, what she understands to be an abusive situation? I mean, none of us would tell our friends who are in abusive situations to go back and endure abuse. But God does that. At least the narrator of the text of Genesis says that's what God says. And she obeys, and she goes back. And I presume the treatment of some sort, ill treatment of some sort, continues. And so now we have the birth of Isaac. And the 8th verse in the 21st chapter tells us that the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. So by this time, Ishmael is at least 16 years old. Isaac, having been weaned, means that Isaac is at least 3. So Isaac is 3, Ishmael is 16, which means that Ishmael was 13 when Isaac was born. So when Isaac is born, Ishmael is already a teenager. Now I want you to pay attention to something in this text, because I think it is where the relationship really does turn sour. It says, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. That text is troublesome. Now you maybe want to why is that text troublesome? It says that Sarah saw Ishmael playing with his brother. That's what siblings do. They play with one another. So here's why that line is troublesome. And it is the line that really shifts the story. And it is the word playing. So scholars are divided on how the Hebrew scriptures are using the word playing. They are divided. On one hand, Sarah, who has always had some level of jealousy against Ishmael being the oldest, perhaps just did not want to see her son playing with his brother. I mean, if we take the traditional interpretation of playing, then you have to ask, so what's wrong with that? I'm not so sure that that's not the interpretation that I ascribe to. I ascribe to the other interpretation because the Hebrew word represents both. I ascribe to this thinking. Sarah heard while Ishmael was playing with Isaac, she heard Ishmael rave about being the oldest child and therefore entitled to a double portion of Abraham's property. Remember, for Sarai, this is all about inheritance. Everything she's doing as it relates to Isaac is about Isaac's future. And it is true that because Ishmael is Abraham's son, even though Hagar is not his wife, in antiquity, Ishmael has a claim, a legal claim on twice the amount of Abraham's property, which means it leaves Isaac without anything. Biblical scholars suggest that what Sarai heard was 16-year-old Ishmael say to his 3-year-old brother, "You may be here, but all of this will be mine." Whether that's true or not, it makes some sense to me because Sarah quickly dismisses Hagar and Ishmael from the household. So look at what happens next. After she hears or sees Ishmael playing with Isaac and overhears perhaps Ishmael celebrating the fact that he's the eldest son, she goes to her husband Abraham, who loves both of his children. He loves both Isaac and Ishmael. He shows no partiality between the two. He acknowledges Ishmael as his oldest son. Sarai goes to her husband Abraham and says to put them out of the house. Now, this part bears some unpacking. She doesn't say to Abraham, Sarai doesn't say to Abraham, blindly dismiss them from the family. That's not what she does. What she says is she's using an old legal custom, and she's asking Abraham to exercise this legal custom. And that custom is this. Abraham has the right to grant emancipation to his slave Hagar and Ishmael. She's saying, liberate them. The same word for marriage, shalom. The same word for marriage is the same Hebrew word for emancipation of slaves. Sarah is saying to Abraham, emancipate her and emancipate your son. By emancipating them, Ishmael loses any right any claim on Abraham's fortunes. So it's not just she's saying, put them out. She's saying, I am asking you to exercise the clause of stripping Ishmael from any future claims on the property. What is interesting about this story is, as old as this story is, we see stories like this played out in our life today, of folk fighting over money and property and resources. Who's the oldest? Who's entitled? Who's most entitled? I mean, it's fascinating that Scripture is able to shine light on things that are happening even in our culture today, and the very things that divide families, personal wealth, and who does it belong to. But nevertheless, Hagar obeys. She takes her son Ishmael, and they go out into the wilderness. So Abraham, who I am certain is torn up, I'm sure he's probably weeping. As a matter of fact, I'm certain he's weeping. He is turning his son out to the wilderness along with his mother. He gives them bread and water. And the text tells us that as she's traveling, so we assume she's going back to Egypt. That's her home. In the wilderness, she's supposed to be going back to Egypt. Notice the text says that when the water in the skin was gone, that tells us that Abraham had placed enough water rations in the skins and enough bread to ensure that she had enough to make it back to Egypt. So my sense is she got lost in the wilderness. She was lost. They got lost. But here's where I find the text very moving. When it became obvious that they were going to die in the wilderness, Hagar tells her 16-year-old son to go sit under that tree. And the text says she sat a bow's throat. That's quite a distance, by the way. When you think about a bow's throat, that's quite a distance. Because she could not bear to watch her son die in the desert alone. She says to her son, I have failed you as a mother. Go and sit under that tree so that I don't have to watch you die. I mean, this is a rich story, worth unpacking. And we're told that the moment Hagar gives up, the moment she resigns herself that she's going to die and her son, her only son, is going to die, the text tells us God opens her eyes. The same phrase is used in Luke's gospel on the road to Emmaus. The two disciples walking with Jesus have no idea who he is. Their eyes are blind, and it's only in the breaking of bread that their eyes are opened and they see Jesus. Here, Hagar is in the desert. She's weeping, and all of a sudden, in her greatest and deepest moment of distress, her eyes are open. And God says, there's a well. Go get water. There are provisions. Go take care of your needs. And of course, then God says, I'm going to make a wonderful nation out of Ishmael. And so you know the story. So God saves Ishmael and Hagar in their greatest moment of distress. That these two people, these two individuals who were marginalized, one was a slave woman, one was the eldest son of Abraham who had been thrown out of the house in the wilderness, no provisions, the heat, they are alone, they are lost, and God shows up. Without fail, the ambulance or the fire truck always comes through. The text is telling us, in our own moments of distress and dis-ease and discomfort, when we feel like giving up, when we feel as if we're at death's door, whether literally or figuratively, God shows up, God opens our eyes, and God reminds us, I have heard your cry, I am here with you. There are some of us who need to hear that message. Because you are in the desert. You have no sense of direction right now. No one understands what you're going through. And it is in that moment that I want to tell you, get ready, because God is about to open your eyes to let you know that you are not alone. What else? The other point that I want to make before I conclude is what's interesting about this passage is this is the first time God speaks in the Bible to a woman about her pregnancy, meaning Ishmael. God speaks to Isaac. I'm sorry, God speaks to Abraham about Isaac. He doesn't speak to Sarai about Isaac. But it's the first time in Scripture that God speaks to a woman, and that woman happens to be not a person of privilege, not a person of power, but she's a person who is on the margins and the fringes. She's Egyptian. She's a slave woman. And God comforts her. The first time God speaks to a woman in all of Scripture is a slave woman to give her comfort. And so, Grace Church, perhaps the richness of this story as we continue to be disciples of Jesus in a world that needs to know and experience the deep love, abiding love of God, perhaps the question for us here at Grace Church, in light of what we know about the Genesis story, is what is God telling us, calling us to do about the Hagars and the Ishmaels in our own society? What is God's call to us about the Hagars and the Ishmaels? How are we to give them hope? How are we to be a blessing to those who feel as if they're lost in the wilderness? And how are we to remind them that when things become bleak, when life becomes chaotic, when they are lost in the wilderness and have no sense of direction, and they're worried about their own life, how are we to say, open your eyes, for God is present? I think this is the power of the Genesis story. On one hand, it reflects what we as human beings fight over all the time: property, material wealth. And you saw just how divisive that is in the Genesis story. But the richness of that story is that while we are fighting over material things, God is able to take that experience and to turn it into something spiritual. At the end of the Genesis story, when Abraham dies, we are told, and this is found, by the way, not only in Genesis, but also in the Quran. When Abraham dies, Ishmael and Isaac bury their father together. The text tells us that Ishmael did not harbor any ill will toward his father for what he had done to his mother and himself. But when his father died, he did the honorable thing. And with Isaac, they buried their father together. That's the power of discipleship. To look beyond one another's faults and to embrace the need. And so, Grace Church, you are indeed a congregation of disciples and apostles. Let us be aware and responsive to the Hagars and the Ishmaels around us.